In China today, a government-sponsored rally drew thousands of anti-student protesters, including some dressed as Uncle Sam. The government reportedly handed out money to attract some of the crowd. In the meantime, soldiers appeared in the streets around Tiananmen Square, where thousands of students are still camped out. So far, the soldiers have made no moves to remove the demonstrators.
The occupation of Beijing's Tiananmen Square is over. The student protests that gripped the world crushed in a bloody nighttime army assault. This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer reporting. And good evening. It is now Sunday morning in Beijing, and Chinese army troops have retaken Tiananmen Square, where thousands of demonstrators have been camped for the last 3 weeks. The army moved in with a vengeance, at some points firing into the crowd before they actually got to the square. By some counts, more than 100 people are dead, hundreds more are injured. Two of our CBS News team, correspondent Richard Roth and cameraman Derek Williams, were caught in the onslaught. We believe they are all right, but they have been taken into custody. Soundman Dexter Leon and assistant Robert Lum managed to escape. For the latest now, we're going to go to correspondent John Sheehan in Beijing. John?
Were last seen being taken at gunpoint by soldiers into the Great Hall of the People. Since then, we have been unable to get any word of what's going on with them. There's still a good deal of shooting going on in the city. Along some of the streets, the armored personnel carriers and some light tanks are breaking down barricades, and soldiers atop the armored vehicles are shooting with rifles at people who throw stones at the soldiers. The military advances took place over a period of 24 hours. First, unarmed troops were sent into the city. They were surrounded by tens of thousands of Beijing citizens. They were stopped in their tracks, and eventually they went back the way they came. The soldiers then returned, not the same units, but others, in buses, and they carried supply vehicles. In those vehicles were assault rifles packed in duffel bags. Those were the first weapons that had been seen. Once again, those soldiers were immobilized by the people. Huge crowds in the streets. It looked like people power was once again victorious over the People's Liberation Army. In some cases, the students and the soldiers were singing together. They were laughing, they were talking. The People's Liberation Army belongs to the people, and that is the argument that it was making sense to the army. But the army wasn't finished. As the seemingly victorious students were collecting military souvenirs, more troops were already on the move. Of the 200,000 estimated troops ringing the city, forces of thousands began to move into the city from 3 directions. And these were not the unarmed troops of yesterday. These were battle-ready combat troops. They moved ahead, sometimes firing as they went. There were ugly scenes of rock throwing, hand-to-hand combat in the streets. Some of those troops were stopped and are still surrounded by people in the streets, but the battle is essentially lost because a huge strike force from the west, consisting of 500 trucks full of troops, an estimated 8,000 soldiers, moved into the city. Tiananmen Square had already been secured by earlier troops, and these were the reinforcements to make sure that the army keeps the square. Bob, through the night there was so much shooting, so many people wounded, so many people dead. The hospitals are overflowing with casualties. We've been able to get some hard information on numbers of casualties. 8 hospitals that would give information add up to 325 wounded, 150 dead. At least 4 other hospitals say they cannot total the figures now. They're too busy, or they refuse to say on the telephone. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
Thank you, John. During the night, Beijing time, before he was taken into custody, correspondent Richard Roth was in Tiananmen Square, and here's how he was describing the scene as Chinese troops moved closer and closer to the square.
Now people are running away from the gunfire, from the advancing troops, assuming they are advancing. I guess they are. There are students running behind them, throwing rocks, picking up debris from the concrete on the square, and hurling it at the soldiers. But again, the soldiers have not yet broken ranks, nor have they fired tear gas. Well, no tear gas, but from where we are, 100 yards away or so, you can certainly smell the smell of cordite from the gunfire. But unlike what we've seen up to now, this is not friendly harassment. These are not demonstrators that can surround the troops and stop them. The troops are all armed. They look to be quite threatening, and the students are too dispersed here to be able to surround them and stop them.
The situation continued to grow more serious, and later Roth filed this report.
Okay, we've got to get out of here. They're after Derek now. They're ripping away his camera. And they're coming for us. We're trying to move back and move away. I'll go.
That was our last report from Richard. Just a while ago, we learned that he and cameraman Derek Williams had been taken into custody. We do not believe that they were hurt. Their two companions did manage to hide out for a moment at the square, later made their way back to the CBS News headquarters.
In Beijing, the symbol of a people's revolution against old-line communism falls to the ground. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. It is morning now, Monday, in Beijing, a city under siege by China's own Liberation Army. Gunfire is still being heard in the streets of Beijing, but in many places, a general eerie, uneasy quiet prevails. The government has finally officially admitted that what it calls some civilians died in last night's massacres. Others say thousands died. Our own CBS News survey of hospitals indicate that the death toll is at least 200. Chinese police today freed two CBS newsmen who had been captured and roughed up a bit by the military, correspondent Richard Roth and cameraman Derek Williams. Our CBS News resident China correspondent John Sheehan has the latest tonight from Beijing.
Dan, the communist leaders lied to their soldiers, telling them there was an armed insurrection attempting to overthrow the government. Now, after the bloodbath, they're trying to hide the terrible result. Today, Beijing is a city enraged. The people call their army fascist and say that the soldiers behaved worse than Nazis. Unarmed civilians have been expressing their anger by setting fire to any military vehicle abandoned or captured. The government acknowledges that 3 soldiers died. Soldiers, weary of the unprecedented assault on their own people, rest in the streets, often surrounded by silent, accusing crowds. The earlier time of debating and bantering with the troops is over for the people who for 2 weeks successfully persuaded convoys of soldiers that the pro-democracy students were expressing all the people's distaste at dictatorship and official corruption. Tanks and armored personnel carriers have been patrolling the streets, often firing bursts of bullets to frighten and intimidate. Still, thousands refuse to cower in their homes. Dan, most of the survivors of Tiananmen Square have withdrawn to the Beijing campuses in the northern part of the city. They took a few captured weapons with them, and some of the students have been making Molotov cocktails. They're convinced that the army plans to attack again. New armor and infantry units have moved into the city in the last couple of hours, but so far, not toward the schools. Dan?
John Sheehan, thanks. We're grateful to report that correspondent Richard Roth and cameraman Derek Williams not only are free now, but are all right, thanks in part to the efforts of U.S. Secretary of State James Baker and the State Department and of the Chinese ambassador in Washington. Roth suffered a cut and a black eye. Otherwise, both men were unharmed. They spent most of Sunday in the custody of Chinese police, having been turned over to the police by the military. Troops seized both men as they reported live from Tiananmen Square during the height of the army attack. Roth reports now how that attack gained momentum, how it looked, and how it ended.
It's midnight. It's Sunday in Beijing, and at the center of the encampment of pro-democracy demonstrators, the loudspeaker the students control is announcing, "The soldiers are coming. We're waiting for them. They won't be able to stop our movement." Government announcers are broadcasting 200 yards away. The army is prepared to take the square by whatever means necessary. Leave now. In fact, the battle has already been joined, but it reaches here only in the sound of distant gunfire and the spread of anxious rumor. The battle is underway, but it's being fought in the broad boulevards beyond Tiananmen Square, where civilians are confronting the troops advancing on this position and falling under heavy gunfire from the People's Army. 4 a.m. and the first signs here of the heat of that battle. Troops now enter Tiananmen Square from the south, where there's no longer much resistance, and some of them have been injured getting here. Their numbers are in the thousands. Now lights in the square are turned off. Students at bonfires show a crowd of several thousand demonstrators, and as the troops file into position circling the square, the students announce they are giving up. From a vantage point at a corner of the square, you can see demonstrators leaving, a column of them carrying flags, walking once around the monument in the center of the square and walking out. But you can't see it for long. Soldiers have spotted CBS News cameraman Derek Williams and myself and are angrily dragging us away. And a moment later it begins, powerful bursts of automatic weapons, raging gunfire for a minute and a half that lasts as long as a nightmare. And we see no more, carried off to an army garrison for detention lasting 19 hours. Richard Roth, CBS News, Beijing.
About 200,000 protesters condemned the Beijing bloodshed today in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the British colony which the British planned to turn over to mainland Chinese rule in 1997. Sympathizers with the pro-freedom protesters blocked streets in Shanghai, China's own largest city. Chinese students and their supporters vented their anger in at least 20 cities here in the United States. Correspondent David Culhane has that.
In Washington, Chinese students and Chinese Americans asked motorists to honk for a free China. Honk if you love democracy. Hundreds responded with a blare of angry sound. Then the thousands of demonstrators marched to the Chinese embassy to deliver flowers of mourning for the dead. The door opened briefly and then slammed shut. The people repeated their simple message: China, freedom.
China, freedom.
In New York, again, thousands marching, saying today all Americans are Chinese in their grief. The students asked for help to keep their movement going. And everywhere they expressed their fury, watching from a distance the death in their own country.
People feel very, very angry. This is a very unbelievable tragedy happening in China.
This is the biggest tragedy in the Chinese modern history. I feel terrible about it.
And in Los Angeles and San Francisco today, indeed in every major city in America, there were tears. Tears for fellow students, for family members killed or wounded. Tears of worry waiting for news. Around the country, students made telephone contact with Beijing and then played the recorded messages for others. The news was terrible.
What they want is only a democracy and freedom, but the government used troops and killed them. This is really very bad.
And wherever the Chinese students were today, they were trying to come to grips with the question of whether they could go home.
We want to go back to fight the killer government, but my parents always keep saying, don't come back, you will be in trouble.
In Houston, students relieved their feelings with street theater, reenacting the bloody scenes of Beijing. And they played the Chinese national anthem. And they wept. David Culhane, CBS News, New York.
President Bush has notched up his response to the killings in China. He is now openly critical, but remains cautious. His aides say that he is anxious to preserve good U.S. relations with the present Chinese government and whatever, if anything, that may follow. But as White House correspondent Wyatt Andrews reports, the president is under increasing pressure to dish out some kind of retaliation.
President Bush for now wants the U.S. reaction to the Chinese carnage limited to words. As he left church today in Kennebunkport, The president stood by yesterday's White House statement deploring the violence and threatening a stall in the U.S.-Chinese relationship.
We already had a statement on that. I hope you read it.
But some members of Congress have read the president's statement and don't think it's strong enough.
It would be politically unacceptable and morally unthinkable, Leslie, for us to continue selling arms to a country which is engaged in the wanton slaughter of its own people.
It is a potential political firestorm for the president, and it begins in the morning.
And I'm going to start tomorrow morning in the Senate to line up bipartisan support to cut off all of that sort of thing. It's folly, and we need to stand with these young people who are trying to achieve freedom.
Supporters of the president argue that events in China are still so uncertain, now is not the time to lash out at the Chinese military.
We don't know who responded. We may have friends in the military in China. In fact, the military in China may become the government before too long.
The controversy means the president returned late today to a Washington different from the one he expected. Rather than bask in the praise of how well he handled Europe last week, he now faces a lively congressional debate over his China policy instead. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Kennebunkport, Maine.
Scenes of destruction and defiance in the streets of Beijing as enraged Chinese take on an army divided against itself. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting tonight from Los Angeles. Good evening. A huge force of soldiers and tanks took up positions in Beijing today. The specter of an all-out civil war hovered over the Chinese capital. More civilians died as tanks fired at unarmed civilians in the streets. Some people tried to fight tanks with their hands. But the occupying army in the capital now seems to be preparing for a possible assault by other elements of the military, perhaps an attempt at a military coup. The Communist Party hardliners who dominate the government of China have had nothing to say. None has appeared in public for several days. John Sheehan begins our coverage from Beijing.
Dan, over the last several hours, there has been the continual sound of gunfire here as Beijing and possibly the country sink deeper into chaos. China's 27th Army holds Tiananmen Square with a force of 160 tanks, plus infantry and other armor. It was principally the 27th that slaughtered unarmed, peaceful protesters. But there are clear signs that some elements in China's army are outraged by the atrocity. The 27th has moved to defensive positions, clearly expecting an assault by other troops, not necessarily in hopes of defeating the superior arms of the killers of Tiananmen, perhaps only to delay or prevent an attack on the defenseless tens of thousands of students barricaded in their campuses. The government announced that the Tiananmen massacre was only the initial victory. The punishment of the pro-democracy movement is to continue.
It's a disaster. It's a tragedy.
Some of the hundreds of American students in Beijing, meantime, began packing up today. Mara Tipi of Minneapolis said she is leaving, but hopes to return. Columns of tanks occasionally rove out of the city center, often firing wildly at civilians. Only the lucky survive.
Did the bullet go all the way through your body?
Yes, through my body and go out from my arm.
Despite the continuing killing, civilians resist with sticks and stones and raw courage and rage. Some soldiers have been murdered, equipment destroyed. And there are now credible reports of soldiers who have set their own vehicles on fire and withdrawn in disgust at making war on their own people. Actually defeating the powerful army positioned around the city center and the Communist Party headquarters would require a concerted effort by armies from several provinces. Even then, there is no guarantee it would succeed. Dan, the appalling crackdown on the students has produced an even bigger and more widespread rebellion and has brought China to the brink of civil war. Dan?
Chuck Sheehan in Beijing, thanks. No one knows how many people have died in the crackdown. We may never know. Our own CBS News review of hospital figures indicates that at least 300 have died. The figure may be as high as 3,000 or more. Many were civilians who went into the street unarmed to challenge the military and were mowed down by machine gun fire or run over by tanks. But amazingly, people were still defying the army today. Richard Roth has one story.
It was noontime today in the center of Beijing when a man walked to the middle of the Avenue of Eternal Peace, which, as it happened, was already occupied. He walked to the middle and stood there. The man was alone. The tank was not. It wasn't just a single tank he stopped. There were 18 tanks and armored carriers in this convoy, and while he talked to the crew and ignored the gunfire, he stopped all of them. One man alone, of course, can't stop an army. Except for a moment, that's exactly what happened here. For 3 minutes in the middle of the day, an army was stopped by a man who stood still. A man who'd made up his mind, it seems, though why we just don't know. But when bystanders rushed in to save this stubborn soul, it wasn't easily done. He was pushed away at last, faceless in the crowd. Safe, we think, but in a city verging on calamity. What moves a man to just stand still? Is it courage or outrage or madness? We can't tell what was on his mind, and we can't forget what he did. Richard Roth, CBS News, Beijing.
President Bush today issued his toughest statement on China so far, saying its leaders were, and I quote now, brutally suppressing a peaceful movement. President Bush ordered limited sanctions, but says he does not want to break relations. Wyatt Andrews has that part of the story.
Abandoning his early wait-and-see approach, the president today sent a get-tough message to the Chinese military. He suspended all U.S. military sales to China, declaring the United States cannot do business as usual.
And I think it's important that the Army know that we want to see restraint, and this is the best way to signal that.
The order puts in limbo $686 million in military sales to China, effectively halting American assistance to the Chinese F-8 fighter program and stopping U.S. aid to 2 ammunition factories. Top-level military visits are also suspended. In addition, Mr. Bush offered Red Cross help for those injured in the violence, ordered a review of U.S. relations with China, and said the United States would sympathetically view requests from Chinese students who want to extend their visits in the United States. Significantly, the president did not suspend any other trade with China or cut off diplomatic relations with Beijing.
This would be a bad time for the United States to withdraw and pull back and leave them to the devices of a leadership that might decide to crack down further.
A group of 4 Chinese students, hastily invited to the White House, hailed the president's new plan.
A measured response, I think, may help the things in China moved toward a good direction.
Despite earlier complaints that the president moved too slowly, this latest plan of action won immediate support.
I think the actions he's taken are prudent, and I agree. I think the United States ambassador should remain there.
We have to condemn what has been happening, but we have to do it in such a way that we do not foreclose the possibility of a closer relationship again.
Yet Mr. Bush will still face pressure to do even more.
I am going to seek contingency legislation to suspend trade, investment, financial and other ties to this brutal communist government.
That the Chinese military appears divided against itself is not seen as a bad sign here at the White House. President Bush, who is reading the tea leaves and watching television just like everyone else, says a splintered military proves a high level of support for the students and that the idea of democracy has taken root in China for good. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, the White House.
The governments of Cuba and Vietnam backed the Chinese government's crackdown and massacre today. The rest of the world reacted with outrage and grief. Bruce Morton reports.
The Chinese government ordered the Chinese army to kill Chinese civilians. The troops fired. People died. Cameras worked. The whole world was watching. Today, all over the world, people protested and raged and cried. In Bonn, they burned an army uniform. This woman works for the Chinese embassy in Bonn, but she was one who cried. Massacre, the banners read. The army used force. The students used what they had, rocks sometimes saws. In Moscow, a quiet protest. They sang too. In English, one line goes, "A brave new world's in birth." Not today. In Beijing, they cried for the dead. In Roanoke, Virginia, a man cried out for a missing brother. One of the largest protests was in Hong Kong, which is to become part of China, this new China, in 1997. Truck drivers sat down, refused to cross the Hong Kong-China border. In Beijing, soldiers died too.
I will go back and fight with
Some Chinese students, like this one at UCLA, wanted to go home and fight. Others marched here.
We do not recognize anymore the government of China anymore.
In Beijing, rubble and protest. In Washington, D.C., marchers and a defaced flag and protest.
People believe that at least they're human beings at the beginning, and now people find out that they're no longer human beings.
Outside the United Nations, which cannot intervene in China's internal killings, chants and marchers. Here and everywhere, tears and anger, grief and rage, all mingled. The whole world was watching. It will never see China quite the same way again. Bruce Morton, CBS News, New York.